Something happens in the space between feeling and showing that most people never think to examine. For the people around you who never seem to cry, who can sit through a film about grief without their expression changing, who can receive genuinely moving news and remain composed, the assumption is that they feel things at a comfortable distance, that they're less affected, that their stillness is evidence of a kind of interior calm. The neurological reality is that it isn't. They're not experiencing less. They're running a faster suppression loop, a more efficient system for catching the physical response before it reaches the surface. And here's the part that doesn't resolve easily on first contact. You, the person who cries more easily, are also running that system. You've probably been running it for years. The press of the tongue against the roof of the mouth, the deliberate shift of attention to something neutral, the quick intake of breath, the preemptive self-deprecating comment that gets ahead of the observation before it arrives. The difference is not that you lack the system. The difference is that what you're managing is larger than what most people are managing, and you've been treating that larger thing as the malfunction, rather than asking what it actually is. You've heard the words before. Too sensitive, too emotional, you need to toughen up, and because no one offered you a frame that fit better, part of you absorbed those words. Not entirely, not without resistance, but enough that you carry a low-grade, persistent version of shame about something that happens in your body before your mind has had any say in the matter. Enough that you spend real cognitive energy trying to appear unaffected by things that are, for you, genuinely affecting. What you have never been given is a tradition that understood your emotional profile not as a dial turned too high, but as a specific and distinct form of perceptual intelligence. Japan has that tradition, and the framework it offers doesn't soften what you are or ask you to rebrand it as a superpower. It names it precisely, and that precision reframes everything you've been taught to be ashamed of. If this is articulating something you've lived but never heard named, subscribe to this channel. More of this kind of thinking lives here. Now, here's the actual mechanism. The standard explanation for crying easily, some people are just more sensitive, commits the same error as explaining a telescope by saying it sees more than the naked eye. It describes the output without engaging the instrument, and without understanding the instrument, you're left holding the symptom with no path to anything deeper. Your amygdala, two small almond-shaped clusters sitting deep in your temporal lobes, operate simultaneously as a threat detection system and an emotional significance filter. When you encounter something emotionally meaningful, a piece of music, a moment of genuine human connection, a scene in a story that mirrors something true you've lived through, your amygdala fires. It marks that experience as something that matters. It initiates a cascade of physical responses, and the speed and intensity of that cascade varies significantly between individuals. People with high amygdala reactivity show a shorter processing window between the initial emotional signal and the body's physical response. The pathway to the lacrimal system, the structures responsible for producing tears, is faster and more direct. This is not a failure of the regulatory architecture. This is a specific configuration of a nervous system with higher emotional operational capacity. You are not being overwhelmed by the emotional input. You are receiving more of it, processed with greater resolution than a less reactive nervous system extracts from the same stimulus. The functional consequences extend well beyond crying. The same neural profile that produces faster tear responses also generates greater activation in the brain regions governing empathy, social cognition, and what researchers in affective neuroscience call mentalizing, the capacity to accurately model the internal states of other people in real time, the reason you raid rooms the way you do, the reason you often know what someone is feeling before they've said anything. The reason you're frequently the person others find their way to when things get genuinely hard, often without being entirely sure why. These are not separate traits that happen to coexist alongside easy crying. They are products of the same underlying architecture. What this means, stated plainly, the thing you experience as excess is neurologically a higher resolution processing channel for emotional information, not noise, not malfunction. Signal. The error hasn't been in your nervous system. The error has been in the interpretive frame you were handed for understanding what your nervous system is doing. American culture made this worse by embedding emotional containment into the definitions of the qualities everyone is supposed to aspire to. Strength is not showing it. Professionalism is composure under pressure. Leadership is steadiness when things break. None of these definitions were explicitly designed to pathologize people with high emotional reactivity, but the cumulative effect of living inside them is a slow, quiet accumulation of shame about a trait that is neurologically among the most socially capable configurations a human nervous system can carry. The Japanese tradition arrived at different definitions, and it built those definitions into concepts precise enough to actually be useful. The first of these is mono no aware. The phrase originates in the Heian period of classical Japanese literature, spanning roughly the 9th through 12th centuries, and was articulated most precisely by the poet and scholar Motori Norinaga in the 18th century, as he analyzed the quality that made classical Japanese texts continue to move readers across generations. The characters translate approximately as the pathos of things, though the translation doesn't fully carry what the phrase means in lived experience. A bittersweet, tender awareness of impermanence, felt as direct experience rather than known as abstract concept. Mono no aware is the specific feeling of watching cherry blossoms fall when you understand that the brevity is inseparable from the beauty, that the same quality making something beautiful is the quality making it temporary. It's the emotional register at the end of something that was good, the particular ache that arrives not from a specific loss, but from contact with the recognition that impermanence is the actual texture of existence, not an interruption to it. Norinaga's argument about who feels this is the part that matters most for you. He wrote that the capacity to experience mono no aware, to be genuinely moved by the transience of things, not intellectually aware of it, but actually present to its weight, and was a marker of refined perception. Someone who felt mono no aware was paying close enough attention to what was actually there to register its full significance. The people who went through life without this kind of response weren't stronger, weren't clearer, weren't more functional. In an important and specific sense, they were seeing less. Notice what this does to the frame you've been carrying. When something small moves you to tears, a piece of music catching you off guard, an unexpected kindness from a stranger, a scene in a story that mirrors something true, your nervous system is not malfunctioning. It recognized something real and responded with proportional weight. The accuracy of the response is the sign of the perception, not evidence of its excess. You're not feeling too much about the thing. You're actually feeling the thing, as opposed to encountering a processed, managed version of it from behind protective distance. This connects directly to the Japanese concept of kokoro, a word typically translated as heart or mind, but carrying a meaning neither translation fully reaches. Kokoro is the integrated center of thought and feeling, the place where cognition and emotion are not two competing systems, but aspects of a single unified process of understanding. Japanese philosophical tradition never positioned emotional depth as interference with clear thinking. In the Kokoro framework, feeling something deeply is not the opposite of thinking clearly about it. It is a distinct and valid modality of knowing, a different channel through which real information about the world arrives. Western psychology spent most of the 20th century constructing frameworks predicated on the opposition between these two things, treating emotional regulation as a primary marker of psychological health, defining cognitive clarity as something achieved partly through the suppression of emotional interference. The neuroscience of recent decades has been quietly dismantling that model, finding instead that emotional processing and social cognition are deeply integrated with the capacities that produce accurate judgment about complex situations. The Japanese tradition described this integration without neuroscience to verify it, built it into cultural practice and language, and produced the vocabulary to name it. Kokoro was always describing the integrated mind that Western frameworks are only now arriving at through data. The implication for you is specific. Every time you apologize for tearing up, you are implicitly accepting the premise that your emotional signal was a processing error in an otherwise functional cognitive system. What Kokoro describes is something structurally different. Suppressing the emotional channel doesn't produce cleaner thinking. It closes one of the pathways your intelligence actually uses to understand what's happening. The tears aren't interference. They're part of the signal. The second concept addresses something particular about the shape of loneliness that tends to develop alongside high emotional reactivity. Takeo Doi, a Japanese psychiatrist who spent decades in clinical practice and comparative cultural research, developed a concept he called Amae, examined most fully in his 1971 work, and subsequently translated and discussed across psychological literature in multiple languages. Amae describes a form of emotional interdependence that Japanese cultural life has historically accommodated and that Western psychological frameworks have largely failed to name clearly, let alone treat as legitimate. Amae is typically rendered in English as dependence, but that translation imports a judgment the original concept doesn't carry. What Amae actually describes is the experience of being genuinely held by someone you trust. The psychological state of relaxing into another person's goodwill without having to manage the impression you're making. The particular quality of safety in a relationship where your emotional reality can arrive without requiring immediate presentation and containment. The state of knowing in your body that you are received. Western developmental psychology positions emotional self-sufficiency as the terminal point of healthy maturation. You develop internal regulation. You stop needing others to stabilize your emotional state. You become a fully autonomous emotional actor. In this framework, the capacity to lean into another person's care is at best a developmental phase, at worst a sign of arrested growth. Douai's research challenged this premise directly. He found that the need for Amae doesn't mature out of existence in adulthood. It changes form, becomes more nuanced in its expression, but the underlying need for genuine relational holding persists throughout the lifespan. More importantly, the suppression of it, not the experience of it, is what generates dysfunction over time. People with high emotional reactivity tend to have a heightened capacity for Amae. They feel genuine connection more viscerally than people with lower reactivity. They're more attuned to the presence or absence of real relational safety. They know very quickly, often without being able to explain how they know, when they are genuinely received and when they are simply being tolerated, and in a cultural context that treats this perceptiveness as excess. The learned adaptation is to suppress not just the tears, but the entire underlying capacity. The capacity to lean, to receive, to let another person's warmth actually land. What results is a specific shape of loneliness that doesn't look like loneliness from the outside. You remain warm, attentive, genuinely present for the people around you. You're often the one others reach for in their hardest moments. But your own access to being present in the way that requires being seen, actually seen, not managed through, gradually closes. You become, without intending to, better at holding space for other people's emotional reality than at inhabiting your own. And when something breaks through the containment system, an unexpected moment of real tenderness from someone who wasn't expecting anything in return, a song arriving at exactly the wrong moment to maintain composure. The tears carry more than what triggered them. They carry everything that didn't have a place to go. The third concept is one you've likely encountered before in a different context, and it's worth meeting it fresh. Wabi-Sabi travels through Western culture almost exclusively as an aesthetic sensibility, the beauty of imperfect, incomplete, impermanent things. The hand-thrown bowl with an uneven rim, the garden that grows asymmetrically because it was never forced into a predetermined shape, the surface worn smooth by use into something manufactured polish could never produce. As aesthetic philosophy, it has been absorbed into interior design conversations and product language and a general ethos of deliberate imperfection. The psychological dimension of Wabi-Sabi is what rarely travels alongside it, and the psychological dimension is precisely what's relevant here. At its core, Wabi-Sabi is a confrontation with the actual conditions of existence. Nothing completes, nothing stays. These are not temporary inconveniences in need of correction. They are the structural properties of what is real. And the stance Wabi-Sabi cultivates is not acceptance as resignation. Not "I suppose this is just how things are," but something more active. A recognition that completeness and permanence are not requirements for value or for genuine presence. The cracked bowl carries a history. The asymmetrical garden is in process. The worn surface holds evidence of time. These are not deficiencies that must be forgiven. They are the marks of something real, as distinct from something merely produced. Applied to your emotional nature, Wabi-Sabi offers a specific reorientation. What you are, including the parts that respond to beauty and loss and small human kindnesses with physical tears, including the parts that register impermanence as actual weight rather than background noise, including the parts that the culture around you has consistently framed as too much, is not an unfinished version of a better regulated person waiting to emerge through enough work. It is the actual configuration of you. Complete in the sense that matters, coherent, real, worth inhabiting directly rather than from the managing distance you've learned to maintain. Think about what happens when you're alone and something moves you, before any audience exists, before any social navigation is required. Your first response is often still to dismiss it, to locate the disproportionality and file it away before you've fully experienced what was actually there. The critical apparatus has become so thoroughly internalized that it runs even without an external trigger. You produce the minimizing for yourself about yourself automatically. Wabi-Sabi makes its most specific claim exactly here, not in the public moment, where emotional containment sometimes has genuine social function, in the private one, in the moment before the management begins, when you're alone with something real and you reach immediately for the reduction. That reflexive cutting short of your own experience in private with no one watching is where this framework asks something direct of you. Stay with it. Not because every feeling is information you need to act on, because a life lived consistently at one remove from your own emotional reality is a smaller life than the architecture you carry was built for. What these three frameworks point toward together is something coherent. Mono no aware names the perceptual capacity itself, the ability to register the emotional weight of impermanence with genuine depth rather than managed distance. It frames this as a refined form of attention rather than as excess, and it positions the people who carry this capacity as those paying close enough attention to reality to actually see it, rather than a processed version of it from behind protective glass. Amae names what that capacity requires in order to function without turning inward and becoming a source of isolation, relational space where it can be received without performance, relationships where leaning is possible without cost, genuine holding that allows the emotional architecture to remain open rather than defensively contracting. Wabi-Sabi names the internal stance that makes both sustainable over time, a relationship with your own incompleteness that doesn't require correction before you're permitted to live directly inside your own experience, an orientation toward your actual nature, and including the unfinished, impermanent, emotionally responsive parts as something worth full inhabitation rather than something to be improved toward a different shape. None of these frameworks asks you to feel less. None of them offer a technique for becoming more comfortable to people who find your emotional responses disproportionate. What they offer is a reframe precise enough to shift the central question. The question that remains once the shame is examined is not, how do I stop this? It is, what is this attention actually for? And what would change if I stopped treating it as the problem? Because the attention doesn't disappear when the tears are better managed. It's still there, still processing, still registering everything it registers. The only thing that changes with more effective containment is the story you tell about what the signal means. Whether it's malfunction or perception, whether it's something to correct or something to understand. And that story, it turns out, determines nearly everything about how you move through your life while carrying it. If there's someone in your life who holds this without having language for it, who apologizes for feeling things with too much weight, who has quietly built walls around something the people around them have never known quite how to hold, send this to them, not to explain them to themselves, to give them a word from a tradition older and more precise than the one that taught them to be ashamed. What comes next on this channel goes deeper into what this tradition understands about emotional sensitivity and the kind of intelligence that most conventional measurements miss entirely. It gets more specific. The tears were never evidence against you. They were proof you were actually paying attention.